Welcome back to Everything Financial Radio here on the Legacy Radio Network. I am your host, Dennis Tubbergen. We are here every week at this time, and we're awfully glad you joined us today. In this segment, I'll be continuing my conversation with Mr. Ian Gordon of the Long Wave Group. And, Ian, I want to jump right in because in the last segment, you said something that I think maybe a lot of listeners didn't grasp, and that was that in the last depression, the last economic winter season, we saw the economy of the United States contract by 45%, and we could see something similar now. Could you maybe put in terms that our listeners could understand what the effects will be if something like that happens? We talked about unemployment, but I'm not sure people actually grasp the fact that a $7 trillion economic contraction, what that would do and how painful that would be.
Well, obviously, if you get that kind of contraction, it has to lead directly to employment numbers. So that if you contract by 45%, you probably get your unemployment. You're going to reduce your employment significantly. I'm not saying it's a one-for-one, but it is going to be a significant reduction. And remember, in the last depression, even though the U.S. unemployment rate was 25%, much more of the U.S. economy was geared to agriculture than it is today. So that, I think the unemployment, if we drop by those kinds of numbers, if the economy contracts by that kind of number, 45%, then the unemployment is going to be much higher than it was after between 29 and 33, simply because more people employed in the industrial sector outside the agricultural sector, as opposed to where they were in the 30s.
Ian, during the Depression, and I love your grasp and study of what's happened economically historically. Where were the good jobs? I mean, if someone's listening to this and they're thinking about doing some retraining, or there's a young person trying to determine what field of study maybe to pursue, where will the opportunities be in this next upcoming economic contraction, if there will be opportunities?
Well, normally what happens, I mean, say in the automobile sector, there were massive job losses because car sales dropped dramatically, as unemployment rose and so on. But normally what happens is that when people are depressed, they do tend to turn to things like drinking, they drink more. And so alcohol probably, sort of something in that sector. And I'm not advising that, but I mean, I'm just saying that, when people are depressed, they seem to sort of seek solace in trying to drown their sorrows and that kind of thing, and they probably smoke more, and it's sort of those industries that probably do quite well. Beer sales will probably be okay and so on, and beer is reasonably inexpensive and that kind of thing. So it's really difficult to say where these jobs are going to be, because it's the whole thing. If we get that kind of contraction in the economy, then the jobs are going to be few and far between. And I mean, the best thing is to hang on to jobs, and the other thing I think that people have to do is really start to try and build their savings so that they have money for this rainy day.
Ian, let me shift gears a bit if I could, because certainly over the last couple of months it seems that Europe has gone from page one news to maybe back page news, or certainly news that you don't see on the front page. Certainly the situation in Spain doesn't seem to be improving. Certainly the situation in Greece, it seems that they're in a full-fledged deflationary depression. Give us, if you would, an update on, from your perspective, where Europe is and where it's headed.
Well, I think that ultimately the whole model has to collapse. The whole the euro model just has to collapse, because again, it's the debt, that's pervasive with not only in these countries but the bank debt and so on. So that it's all interrelated, and I just can't see. I mean, I know that they're desperate to try and keep the thing together, and I think Germany is working very hard to try and keep the euro together. And in effect, in so doing, they're taking away a lot of the democratic rights of people. They're imposing, like in Italy, you have a bureaucrat that's now in the government, an unelected person leading the government in Italy, and the same, to some extent in Greece and so on. So they're, we're losing a lot of democratic rights. The governments are sort of starting to foist, austerity and so on the people. So I really think that things are going to eventually get out of hand, and I think the whole system is going to collapse. I've long forecast that the whole world monetary system is going to collapse under the massive weight of debt that's pervasive throughout the world. So, and that collapse is going to be quite similar to the monetary collapse that occurred in the 30s. I think people forget that there was a monetary collapse in the 30s in the last depression. And so we've long anticipated that the system would collapse again in this depression as well. So it's not just the euro that I think is going to collapse, but ultimately the dollar is going to collapse as well, because there's just too much debt in the economy, in the U.S. economy. There's something like $56 trillion of total debt in the U.S. economy, and that's that's has to be sort of washed out, and it's going to be a very ugly process, that washing out, and it's going to be the currencies, the world currencies, are going to be in dire straits.
Ian, I know that some listeners may be surprised to hear you say that during the 30s, during the Depression, there was a monetary collapse, and I think that might be news to some listeners. Can you fill in some details for us?
So, before the First World War, most countries were on a gold standard system. In other words, their currencies were directly backed by gold. But when the war was declared, the combatants went off gold so that they could print paper in order to fight the war, because it was going to be expensive, and if they were still gold backed, they would lose all their gold if they printed a lot of paper money. So after the First World War, the world kind of, in about 1922, I think, at Genoa, the world went back to what was called a gold exchange standard system. And that system was essentially gold backed, but also two currencies, the dollar and the pound, were also included and considered to be as good as gold. So central banks around the world could have gold backing their money, their currency, or they could have dollars and pounds backing their currency. So it was a quasi-gold standard system. And so going into the 30s, into the Depression after the 29 crash, the debt, just as it is now, the debt started to become a real problem because unemployment was rising, and we had essentially in 1931 a failure of an Austrian bank called the Credit'Ange Bank. And that failure, everybody was trying to bail that bank out, including J.P. Morgan, the Bank of England, Austria itself, and so on. But trying to bail out that bank, and no one was successful in bailing out that bank. Austria was eventually forced off this gold exchange standard system, in effect bankrupted. So Austria left. And then what happened was that, and Germany followed shortly thereafter, and then what happened was that speculators started to sort of look at, say, well, this system is starting to collapse, this monetary system is starting to collapse. Now, who's likely to be the next country to leave? And they looked at the British pound and decided that Britain had come back on the gold exchange standard system and tied the pound to gold at the same rate that the pound would be tied to gold prior to the First World War. So, and Britain wasn't the same economically or financially as she had been prior to the First World War. So they started to turn in their pounds for British gold, and eventually Britain in September 1931 was forced off the gold exchange standard system, and essentially most of the Commonwealth followed her out of the monetary system. And the whole system had effectively collapsed by the end of 1931. And even the mighty dollar, the U.S., the world's greatest creditor nation, wealthy nation, and so on, was effectively and finally forced off the gold exchange standard system in 1933 when Roosevelt was president. So the whole system collapsed. And world trade, because of that collapse, because no one trusted anybody else's money, but Britain could trade with the Commonwealth, America became very isolationist. She basically went back into the United States. She had all the oil she needed. She had all the agricultural products she needed. So she didn't have to bother about trading with anybody else. But world trade during that time contracted by about 80%. And of course, that also affected the world economies. So the system collapsed, and it wasn't really revived until 1944 when Bretton Woods was set up, establishing the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And the dollar was backed by gold at $35 an ounce at that time. And the U.S. had plenty of gold to back the dollar. People couldn't exchange their dollars for gold. In fact, Americans were forbidden to even own gold until 1972, I believe. But so that existed until 1971, that system of the dollar being backed by gold until 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, in fact, took the backing of gold for the dollar away, so that now we have the whole world is subject to a fiat paper money system, and that is the system that is now in a state of collapse.
Ian, you've been on the program in the past and talked about John Law's France. We've talked about a number of paper money systems that have failed. In fact, that always seems to be the ultimate destination of a fiat currency. The question is just, how long is it going to take to get there, and when are we going to get there? Can you answer the when are we going to get there question in the couple of minutes we have left, or at least give us your best estimation?
Well, what you're seeing is really this desperate efforts to keep the system alive right now. I mean, desperate efforts in Europe, the U.S., the Federal Reserve, through quantitative easing, sort of buying U.S. government debt and now buying mortgage-backed securities, And so there's this effort on the part of all central banks to keep the paper money system alive. And that was, of course, the same historically in the time of John Law's paper money scheme in France in about 1720, 21, and the same when the French assignats during the French Revolution. So as the paper money system started to collapse and trust in paper money started to wane on the part of people, and they started to demand payment in other forms, especially precious metals, the governments were desperate to try and keep the system going, the paper money system. So effectively what they did, and what we're seeing today is what they're doing today, is they just printed even more of it. And that money printing eventually, the whole thing collapsed under the weight of the paper money simply because no one trusted it anymore and refused to be paid in paper money, wanted to be paid in precious metals.
Well, Ian, always a pleasure to have you on the show. We're going to have to leave it there. I hope you'll come back.
Of course I will.
All right. Well, Everything Financial Radio here on the Legacy Radio Network will return after these words. Stay with us.